Today, we're talking about social entrepreneurism. This is now the third conversation that we've recorded. And what I'm really enjoying is that it gets us to think spontaneously about what we're doing. We're talking about impact programs, sustainability, the regenerative movement, looking at how we get rid of the traditional centralized hierarchy in management and projects, and trying to understand and relate to the differences that creates for us as individuals and the effectiveness, hopefully, of our movement that is different to the limitations and the challenges that the social entrepreneurship space has experienced to date.
I've been part of the Haifa DAO now for a little bit over 2 years, and I had no idea what I was coming into. So I didn't have a sense of like, I want to explore a DAO or I wanted to be part of a decentralized organization. I had no preconceived notions. And some of the things that I've learned here is that it is better if you know what you're signing up for, that you are welcomed into the community with a sense of this is how we operate, this is how we care for each other, this is how decisions are made. And that, for me, that journey was very much kind of exploratory and learned over time. So one of the things that I would like to emphasize, when a DAO is coming together for purpose and they can define that purpose and that they can share in the journey toward that purpose, welcoming in new people and integrating them into it is part of the commitment that each person makes to each other in a DAO. And that is a really important characteristic.
Yeah, that's great, Mark. I agree with you. And I'd like to go deeper into this sense of purpose and how a horizontal structure that we're seeing in a DAO empowers that sense of purpose, both personally as well as collectively, as well as an organization, versus how more vertical traditional structures can really hinder that. I myself have worked for over 2 decades as a pioneer in systemic transformation, both as an entrepreneur, business leader, as well as a system scientist. And I joined Haifa more than 3 years ago. It's been an incredible journey. And the reason why I have also invested my time and resources, also the virtual space with Haifa, is because I really, really believe that Haifa is pioneering a new paradigm in purpose-driven organization, purpose-driven entrepreneurship for a thrivable world and future. I found myself both as an entrepreneur, but also as a scientist, looking deeply into those issues on systemic transformation in terms of what is hindering purpose, what is hindering our thrivability. That is always controlled, imposed, central structures where other people are telling you, well, this is our purpose, this is our mission statement, these are our values, you better memorize it well, and this is what we want you to do. And it doesn't work like that. So the beauty of the DAO with a conscious culture, and in Haifa, we even have a constitution. The beauty of the DAO is that it requires quite a high degree of maturity, self-responsibility, as well as holding each other to account to allow that deeper purpose to emerge. And this is really the journey. And the experimentation that we've been in Haifa hasn't always been easy. Of course, we've encountered many different challenges. But by embracing those challenges together, living into those questions, going through sense making, meaning making, looking at how can we align our collective intelligence potentials for the greatest outcomes. It is out of that journey that the Haifa DAO tools and products and services has emerged.
The way things work in Haifa is that we are all entrepreneurs, right? I realized that technically entrepreneurs are more adopted to the way humans living before than big businesses. But I think this change really needs to start from inside, and then it expands out, which is having impact, which is then social entrepreneurship.
And I guess we got to make that distinction. What kind of organizations might we see as not being a purpose-driven or a social entrepreneurship type of venture? What comes to my mind is something like a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi. I understand people need to drink, right? But I think they can drink something that is more supportive of health. Generally, I think wellness, well-being, and health are aspects of thrivability. And I see that as being what I consider to be social entrepreneurship or purpose-driven entrepreneurship. Is trying to do good rather than an excuse for making a profit that doesn't serve well-being.
To me, this is the moral compass, the ethics that are embodied by a DAO that has the capacity, whether it's a traditional organization or a DAO, it's that we have to move to a more regenerative mindset for how we as organizations relate to the world around us, as opposed to an extractive mindset. So there is a transition that we have an imperative to make over the next small number of years. The next decade, we have to put substantially less carbon in the atmosphere than we are doing now. And that's going to require a kind of an awakening, a kind of organizational structure to facilitate the value for the commons, the value of regeneration. Organizations have classically, from a social entrepreneur standpoint, have been looking how do they conserve to extract value for their organization. And there is no balance sheet item, there's no accounting for nature or for the commons in that type of space. I usually use the example, if a McDonald's had to charge onto their balance sheet every heart attack, it would be a very different company. You know, things in regular organizations that are outside of that boundary are not considered. And when I think of Haifa and I think of the DAO space and the network of ecosystems of DAOs, I see a pathway for humans to organize and collaborate in a manner that in fact will honor the commons, will honor the holding capacity, the carrying capacity of nature. And that's where the shift to a regenerative mindset versus extractive for organizations is so important.
I think these are important points, and I want to go deeper into how does a DAO empower also social entrepreneurship? That is going much further than your triple bottom line. And that's the old business as usual. And as we know, business as usual is at the moment a trajectory towards collapse, as Mark was also saying, because that comes from very extractive business models. So if you are a social entrepreneur, or you are what's called these days also a net positive, impact for net positive entrepreneur or organization, then it's no longer good enough to just have that as your mission and your vision statement, or even in your sustainability reporting, whatever framework you're using. You have to look whether the structure of the organization that you are using is appropriate for that purpose, for achieving those outcomes. And this is where DAO becomes really, really interesting for many reasons. First of all, DAOs are programmable. Wow. And what that means, in our case, what we have done with that, we therefore programmed it in line with our values, in line even with living systems protocols, rather than a mechanistic business model. We have really programmed the DAO for that really high purpose of a highly, massively transformative impact. Because what we've been exploring as a DAO is, what is our license to exist? And it comes back also indeed on that example of Coca-Cola. Well, what is the license to exist for Coca-Cola, or for a cigarette company? More and more these days, for entrepreneurs, for businesses, organizations, industry sectors, the leading question is, what is your added value to society? And how are you taking responsibility for the impacts that you're causing? And if you want to stay in the market and you want to be really a leader in the field, you need to have very clear answers to that. But you also need to have the appropriate organizational structure to be able to drive that and create engagement. One more thing I'd like to unpack on that is, if we're talking about engagement, Generation Z loves DAOs. Why? Because they're really purpose-driven entrepreneurs, young leaders, who are very, very strong in their commitment on transparency and accountability by design. So programmable for high purpose, measurable impact. And what they address is the common alignment and coordination failures of many of the mainstream organizations, when we have a wonderful purpose, wonderful mission, but because they can't coordinate and align their talent and their collective intelligence potential, they are internally not coherent.
That organizational structure, which is more different than it's easy to put into words. It's the experience that brings it to life, and learning how to communicate that, or to invite organizations to collaborate and participate in the learning curve that we're going through, while we're not just building the technology through the Haifa DAO, but we're also experimenting with how to use the technology, because it does give us so much free reign on doing things. It's an experiment. It's a gamified way of managing, and we have to figure that out as human beings and relate to each other in very different ways than traditional organizational structures. It doesn't have to be grandeur kind of thinking as well. It can be local communities or an individual or a team of 5 or 10 people thinking that we have an important thing that we want to do, and we need to be able to monetize. We need to be able to demonstrate that we're actually delivering impact. We're proving the value so that we can bring on supporters or participants. These are very grassroots movements, not just massive organizational use cases as well.
I wanted to add one more thing there on the monetization. As we all have been learning more about the ecosystem and individual choice, individual actions, I've been reading that as a single human being, the 2 most important impactful things I can make for nature are to stop taking airplane flights and to eat a plant-based diet. Those are the 2 that the scientists tell us are easy things to keep track of yourself, things that we can do. In DAOs, these can be represented through measurable actions, by measurable actions that emit tokens. So if you have a community of 1,000 people, they can be creating tokens that represent their commitments and the actual results that they are achieving as a community. And those tokens are now things that can be part of the value flow chains, the type of collaboration and coordination that can happen once you have units of tokens. It opens up huge possibilities, and this is the programmable nature of how DAOs can work in collaboration with each other.
On my end, maybe some people from climate movement don't like these type of comments, but I was really closely following in last 2 or 3 years. And my ultimate understanding is that the point is not to not do something and do something, not eat meat. For me, what I'm realizing, one part is extractive, but extractive mindset is kind of war mindset. So you're in war with everything. You're in war with yourself. You're in war with outside world. And then the climate activists have tendency to guilt shame us, right? And then we feel shame for riding an airplane or doing this. But eventually, I think our ultimate kind of rule of thumb should be the joy. Because I think for me personally, that's kind of how can we help climate? I have feeling there will be a lot of friction when people start to organize. And what we see in our world is that people maybe have experience with pyramid structure, and then they want to move away from that. And then they are proposing radical decentralization without any authorities, and then we lose that. The biggest change is this change of, in a sense, moving away from full control. You have control, but it's not control that's considered in traditional sense, where you have one metric, then you are moving that metric either goes up, or if it does not go up, you are fired. I think there are like much more subtle things that are happening. And for me, that's kind of the magic of DAO and magic of social entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I do like to come back to one point that Mark made, I think is important. That's about the tokenomics, because this is really, really unique to DAOs, and it's incredibly important. I've been working in the field of sustainable development and transformation and change for such a long time. And one of the key tools that was missing to truly drive behavior was to be able to design the right incentives, the right feedback loop, and also to make visible all the different values flows, including even a multi-capital model. And I think this was really unique about DAOs. So DAOs provide us those tools as an organization, but also as a movement, as an ecosystem, as a network. And that's really powerful. So here you have the DAO kind of technology and tool and innovation, really for social innovation. But that tool can be applied at a micro scale. It can be at a macro scale. It can be at a planetary scale even. So I really feel that what is this coming out of is a whole new paradigm for how people like to group together, to team up and to partner, to face and embrace and take on the greatest challenges of our time. And for a very long time, we were looking at, well, where can I do that in an organization where I feel I can be really aligned in terms of what are my personal values? What do I really care for? What is important to me? What do I want to make a commitment to? As well as my organization. And I think that's the beauty with Haifa. We're not asking people to sacrifice or diminish their humanity. We're not asking them to just be only productive. No, your humanity is essential to everything that we're doing here. And this is also, I was saying that Haifa is creating DAO tools for humans. Even the word decentralized sounds sometimes very dry, very cold, very technical. I think the DAO is just a name that we have given to an experimentation that's taking place as a whole new paradigm for how people are working together to take on the greatest challenges of our time. And out of that process also comes our evolutionary development, comes our maturation. One reflection I like to share on this is as a mother. If you have kids and mom goes out of the door and the kids are together, in the beginning you're like, great, yeah, and there's going to be a mess. But if you leave them a little bit longer, they're going to have to figure out not to fight and how to make agreements. A lot of these top-down organizations are very parental organizations. There's still this sense of authority imposed and the fear of consequences, or perhaps sometimes even punishment, right? But in a DAO, you don't have that. There's no parent overseeing your shoulders. And that means that the DAO tool now is going to help you to make agreements. And we can make those agreements on chain. But that requires a collective sensing process. That requires a lot of conversations. And that also requires honoring everyone's input and a diversity of perspective, out of which then these transformative solutions emerge.
I can resonate with a lot of what you're saying. It's not just a new process. People think of DAOs as a new process. It's decentralized decision making, or it's decentralized governance. And what does that mean? That means that everybody votes on stuff, or everybody can weigh in on something. That exists. That's just democracy, right? It's not about voting or governance. It's about your relationship to everybody else in the DAO. It's a change in power structure. It very much reduces the asymmetrical power structures that we see in most traditional companies, which is I'm an employee, you're a boss. I effectively have no power, you have all the power, right? It's like 100 to 0. Whereas in a DAO, especially one that's built with anywhere near reasonable principles, it's far more merit-based, but everybody has a baseline amount of authority just by being in it, right? By the very nature that you're a member of the DAO, you join the team, you will be heard. You will have influence over what you do. I was just talking earlier today with one of our other team members that we work with, and he brought up the idea of the principal agent problem. And that's really what I've been saying. It does. It just solves for the principal agent problem. You're no longer in a situation where you don't have any control over your destiny. So you can kind of have some input, not only into your work, but into your future. And this is something that entrepreneurs have been trying to solve for a very long time. And they've done it mostly to date with financial incentives, missing the point that what I think gets the ownership is this sense of control over one's destiny. That's far more important to people. Just like when you see the data on compensation and what really drives people with jobs, it's not how much they make. There's job satisfaction or attraction to a job. Compensation is usually third or fourth. It's important, of course, but people want input over the work they do. They want meaning, right? They want fair evaluation, right? And so DAO provides all of those other things in a way that I don't think anything else has ever been able to do it before.
The restrictions imposed by their boss. That's what I learned as number one reason people change job, because basically they don't like their boss. It doesn't mean that the boss is not a nice person necessarily. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't like them on a personal level. It's that they don't feel that they can do what they want to do because of this imposed central authority structure. And that's what we can completely take away. We've been talking about these big terms: social entrepreneurship, impact, sustainability, the movement, the trends that are happening in the world. What does it actually look like in real terms, experimenting on this alternative type of structure? In terms of operations, day to day, what does the DAO experience look like? And Lois, you spoke about feedback loops and incentives, how Haifa has done those things or evolved those things from your point of view.
The first thing that comes up to me, I remember in the beginning days already of Haifa, this was in 2019, 2020, how there was a token rewards contribution for facilitating, for space holding. And I remember coming into Hive, I thought, that's fantastic. That is honored, that's acknowledged. You can actually apply for a role in those days as holding space, as facilitating and sense making. And in many organizations, these are considered to be more feminine qualities, and that very often is completely missing because it's not valued. So that's the first thing I'd like to reflect on with HIFA. Another way that I found myself as a social entrepreneur, but also seeing HIFA as a platform for social entrepreneurs, is the way that we've been experimenting, applying, refining, and evolving sociocratic principles. That's also really important. So there's been a lot of discussion, dialogue, diversity again of perspectives out of all of this. Coming back to the question of what does governance mean to us? So because a lot of people have a very traditional understanding of the word governance, and I myself, I used to also be a trainer in corporate governance, for example. You do an assessment of the corporate governance, you look at all the policy documents, and it's very often at the top level again of the organization. But here, governance in the DAO means something completely different. It doesn't come down to just your policy document, but governance is really about how are we deciding together on both the opportunities, on our shared responsibilities, on the way that we are rewarding and acknowledging contribution, on the way that we are giving voice, but governance also in terms of how do we make sure that in all that diversity that can sometimes be divergent, because there are, of course, tensions, we are human, we're learning, but how can we then come back to that coherence to say, hold on, how do we find alignment on common ground? And what does governance mean in terms of governance for our collective thriving? As a DAO, as an ecosystem, as a network. So the kind of the questions that we've been living into at HIFA are constantly shifting between the I and the me and the we and the us. And that's really beautiful. And they are here not opposed, but they are each different perspectives that deepen the other. And it's in that creative tension by what we've been learning, and we're still learning that, by embracing that creative tension. How do I do that? How can I be true to myself and my values and the values also of the DAO and the commitments that we've made? So it's like the DAO has been this space that has allowed us to make visible and hold this creative tension. I believe that has been the critical key out of which social innovation has emerged, but also a sense of a collective consciousness even, of a sense of being able to tune in when there is dissonance at a collective level. And I think that's fundamental to going from an organization to becoming an organism, and how we see ourselves, each of us, as living cells within that organism of interdependent relationships. Reciprocity is key. There's an indigenous grounding principle: in the herd of one is the herd of all. The honor and success of one is the honor and success of all. In a DAO, that becomes really, really concrete, is that we are in it together. And we need to evolve and learn together.
I also had a question for all of you, and I know Anna first inspired me when I first met her. I heard comments from two ends of the spectrum. One end of the spectrum is decentralization is best. We should do everything decentralized, voting, full-on technology solutionist. And then on the other end, why we need technology at all. So I'm just curious to hear from all of you, what is your take, why we need technology to enable social innovation, and what this technology is actually bringing?
A long time ago, I realized this idea that people, myself included and others, can have so much going on in our head that it can be really, really, really helpful to write stuff down on a piece of paper. We get all of that busyness and the long list and the weight of our considerations in front of us, and it creates a level of objectivity or maybe some kind of psychological, emotional distance. We can actually see that, okay, so there's 7 things on my list and I need to organize them and I need to do them. And that's on that personal level. And I think that I'm kind of segueing into responding to your question. When you're trying to create agreement between people, we could get on a call like this and speak for 4 hours, 5 hours and debate and go back and forth and get frustrated and et cetera, and it's difficult to come to an agreement. This is one of the fundamental problems. And when we have a platform, when we have a technology, when we have something where we can, in a sense, sit side by side and look externally at something that has a little bit of distance, and instead of pointing at each other, we're both pointing in the same direction at this artifact, at this proposal that's on the DAO, on this record that is on chain, or if it's in staging. And then it gives us a chance to reflect in a different psychological way than just if we're speaking at each other. Maybe it's simplistic, but at the same time, I think it's very profound because of that difference, again, just on the individual basis. It's a very, very different personal experience to carry stuff in your head versus just putting it down on a piece of paper. So when we're, as a little community, we put stuff down on the platform, on the immutable on-chain record of agreements, and then we look at that, then our collective shared space, that space making, is a very, very different quality to anything that's ever happened before.
You kind of now inspire me to think about that kind of this saying that printing press enabled democracy because it enabled people to read, and then they were able to educate themselves and make decisions, and then say, okay, I will vote like this. So without that, people are not able to have democracy. It's very interesting, this perspective that DAO tooling at the end is psychological tooling. I was not thinking about that, but I think at the end it comes to that. It's kind of how we react to that, and then how we use all of these tools to coordinate things further.
On one level, it's that psychological effect of collective reflection. The other part of it is the fact that we get rid of central authority. No bosses, in a really simplistic way of putting it. I'm wondering, again, from your guys' perspective, how do we make the connection between what purpose-driven projects need to achieve and the limitations that they've experienced in doing that versus the space making that Anna Lois suggested that we create, and this technology that we have for collective reflection? How do we see that changing the way that purpose-driven projects can actually start to operate?
I first want to come back to the word decentralized. I like to catch this because we're speaking these words and it puts images in our minds. And actually, this has been a tension also within Hyphen for several years, but expectation of decentralized was like, well, how do we then align? And how do we then agree? And how do we then agree on a common purpose? Yeah. And in that conversation, what I brought up consistently, and this is from a living systems perspective, that every living system has a center. The center is everywhere. The center of the universe is everywhere. But the center in a living system is not imposed. It's not central. It comes from the coherence and actually comes from the purpose for collective thriving. So I want to bring back that how purpose, having agreement on a common purpose for the DAO, but also having agreement around the purpose for how the DAO contributes to this critical point in time, and an agreement around what that technology now for the DAO is needing to empower and make possible for humanity to make the great transformations feasible. So those different levels of agreements to purpose, that's what creates a center. And it creates for people an amazing sense of being centered. Because in that centeredness, it's like we feel that our own personal purpose and potential can flourish. And now let's add to that another layer. It gives you the means of input. You can say, let's slow down, we're not yet ready for a road. Or maybe we need to review and we need to evolve that again. So we are together now co-creating the governance systems. And we're also together becoming the game changers, because we can together co-create and also decide on the rules of the game. We can together, out of that space, also co-create the new technologies and tools. That's what we've been doing in Haifa. That emerged first in the collective space of visioning together, sensing into the future. What's the future asking from us? By living into those questions of, if we truly are a technology innovator for transformative social impact, then what are the technology solutions that we need to be able to bring into the world and steward? Just having that space even to ask that question together. It's out of that process then that innovation happens, experimentation happens, testing is happening. To me, this is the greatest value and asset of Haifa. It's that culture, it is that capacity And the tools that we've developed has come out of that process. Our real asset is the way in which, through HIFA, as a DAO, we have been able to align our collective potential for becoming a force of transformative, positive impact, and also to operate as a learning organization. That's really important too, where we give that feedback to each other. If tensions arise, well, let's have a conversation about that. We have councils and we have circles. So we have circles being really product oriented, getting stuff done. And we have councils. We have alignment councils. We have thrive councils to see how we're learning, how are we growing, what do we need to pay attention to? Do we have an agreement or not? And if not, that's okay too, but let's make it visible. So this is of tremendous value. And that's also where people get a sense of belonging, of ownership for the journey and for everything that's emerging from that.
Technology that we are building is a mirror for social transformation, right? Because of the nature of the blockchain, they're public. Accountability of your social transformation is visible. There is this thing in open source code project that although they're open source, nobody is actually going to read it, but just psychologically, because they are open source, people who are writing their code, there is less chance that they're going to do anything malicious, because at any point somebody can open GitHub, open the code and see what's happening. Although there is very little chance that actually that's going to happen. So I see that in terms of social transformation, this nature of technology really make us think differently. And without needing to understand all of these complex terms, if you are a business who is in the space of social transformation and ask yourself, why should I create that out of my organization? It is really because it's kind of deeper mirror of what you are doing and as a feedback mechanism. So first you have feedback mechanism to yourself. I just think kind of when you see, okay, where money, how much money went in, how much went out, and are you satisfied with the impact that you're having? And then other feedback mechanisms such as, okay, other core or community members are kind of participating in this. Is this what we're doing? So it creates these feedback loops that before are possible, but because of the nature of technology, it's much easier to get them. So it amplifies these things and it gives you instant mirror. In the same way our other technology enables us, right? Before people were using compass and it was like you look at the compass and now you have satellites where you can have instant feedback between where you are going and where you should go. So it's kind of the same for businesses. And on a human level is that DAO really inspire human relationship and it creates social cohesion. It's on organizational level, but I feel for me personally, it's even deeper because becoming member of HIPA, although I was aligned with many values, it helped me align deeper because you're constantly need to think, what do I want? Do I want to do this? Am I satisfied with this? So it really helps you out. This space of uncertainty helps people align among themselves. And I think this space of uncertainty is going to happen over and over and over again. And that's kind of magic of DAO, where it's not that you have boss and his opinion is where the ship will go, but the ship can go at any direction and it depends on the group. And I think that's uncomfortability of being in DAO and magic of being of DAO. Social cohesion by natural agreement. If we imagine DAO as a game, this part that everything is a public add weight to the decisions. We can change decision, we can upgrade decision, but we need to make decision and these decisions are public.
I had an image come to mind from what you guys have just been explaining. I'm imagining, like, I like that distinction of centralization versus decentralization. I think we have a center. I think that's an amazing, simple but profound insight. And I'm imagining the organizational purpose. We spoke about a purpose-driven organization. If we imagine that right in the middle of our diagram here, and then the circles that we use in our terminology in HIFA, they represent aspects of fulfilling that purpose. And we could write it as a statement. We could write the circle as a statement of contribution towards the center, which is the overall purpose. And we can break this down. You can imagine a diagram of sub-circles. They're really sub-statements of the contribution. I like the idea of distributed decision-making. So it's pushing those decisions as far out away from the center as people want and are capable to contribute. Some kind of a hierarchy of statements of contribution and that people, that individuals can participate and contribute towards. And we all get to shape and identify and clarify and respond to and pivot and adapt to the changing circumstances in an organic way. And so we're learning what is that hierarchy of statements or contributions that need to happen to fulfill that center. For me, nice reflection, nice picture.
I love that. And what you just described is also a fractal pattern. That's what holism is about. Holonic, holarchy instead of hierarchy. So in holarchy, holo means wholeness. What you're seeing is that when there's distributed decision making, even the universe does that. It distributes also decision making and autonomy. But it doesn't mean when you're moving away from the center. No, the center is within.
Like some kind of a diamond or a prism. You're looking in from one face, but you're looking in and the center is still there. And it's part of the reflection that passes through the whole.
It's a pulse. And that's what's the beauty. When our hearts align, rhythmically becomes a resonance pattern. So we're experiencing ourselves being centered. And that's the beauty without any control. That's the difference also between coherence and cohesion. Coherence is a flow state. Cohesion is often a structure.
I really like this idea of purpose at the center. That makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking in terms of Haifa DAO's purpose and what are we trying to accomplish ultimately? Well, we're building this software that enables other people to have the same experience that we're having. And so if something we're talking about, and I feel like it's pulling us away from that purpose, that's my reference point. It's a really interesting way to think about it, that it does put the meaning or the purpose at the middle. Like I could see it being the same for a nonprofit or something. The mission's in the center. And the sense making kind of revolves around that point throughout the group. There most certainly are going to be numerous additional use cases, implementations, interpretations, and variations of this concept and this model, because another element that comes up for me all the time is cooperation versus competition. The DAO structure invariably pulls a lot of the competition out of it, because I'm not really competing with other people for my role per se. I'm simply trying to fulfill the commitment I've made to everybody else when I put my proposal through the DAO for my role. If I said, well, I'm going to do this and this and this, that doesn't put me in competition with anybody anymore, because I'm not going to go up because I beat you or I outshine you. I imagine in a place where people really want to hold on to these sort of cutthroat ideals, they will, but the DAO will be almost constantly pulling you away from that, really, because at a certain point, you'll start to sound almost silly. We had a situation recently where I think there was just a conflict around a wondering of where the authority lied in a certain situation. Was it here? Was it here? And I think what we all came to collectively was, well, it lies within kind of all of us. And it's a collective authority. It's not, oh, this person or that thing or this particular role or whatever. It was like, well, the authority is collective. We all need to understand that. We need a mutual respect then if the authority is going to be shared in a practical or pragmatic way, meaning that two people are going to be doing the same type of work. There needs to be a sort of a mutual respect of the authority of the position. And so it still ultimately ends up trying to pull you away from this competitive thing. And if you resist it, you almost start to look silly, is the point. If you go too long with this resistance, the group and the other people in the DAO are going to kind of look at you like who you're fighting against. Like there's nobody in your way. There's nobody trying to cause you any problems. Just do what you need to do kind of thing. And so this competitive mindset has permeated business globally for millennia, I guess. And I think we're genuinely moving away from that, or certainly DAOs are one of those first steps that say there's another way to do it. And competition isn't the only way to bring out the best in people. It's been this kind of default. I've always seen it as kind of sloppy, right? Or a bit of a sledgehammer approach. Like, well, if we want to motivate people, we pit them against one another, and then we make their livelihoods the stakes. It's like, holy shit, that's a blood sport. Like, that's like how did we ever deal with this? No wonder why we've all been so stressed out, and business has been described as things like cutthroat and backstabbing, and like, my God, how did we ever get anything done? You know, it must have been just some part of our own individual merit and kindness that's allowed us to kind of accomplish much of anything. Because if you really thought about that enough, you'd spend all your time just kind of defending yourself against your teammates rather than wanting to work with them, because in a sense, they don't provide you anything of value when it comes to your job. At the end of the day, you're pitted against them. And if you can in any way make them appear as if they're underperforming, that's to your advantage. It's not to your advantage to help them. Not really. I mean, sure, if you have a company with the right culture and the right management and all these other things, then sure, teamwork will be rewarded. But, you know, that's rare, and that's kind of its own bird. But I think the DAO changes that as well. And that's revolutionary. Absolutely. Because I just don't know how we got anything done the more I think about it, you know, in this other sort of scenario with the hierarchical, top-down bosses, authority, asymmetrical authority. Oh God, it's just, yeah.
Yeah, just like to add to what Dominic was saying, which I think was really important. Thank you for making those points. It's that if we're looking at where that structure of competition hierarchy comes from, that these were empire building models. Yeah, we started to do that 6,000 years ago when we wanted an organizational model to dominate over other people in order to extract resources, fight our way through, colonize the world, right? So these are 6,000 years old. And we're coming out of that paradigm now. And that's been bringing it. Of course, we learned a lot, served its purpose. Modernization, the industrialization has also happened. We are benefiting from that, sure. But look, we've come to the end of that model. And the DAO movement is the next paradigm. It's future facing. It comes from who we really want to be as people. And also as a final reflection, the beauty then, if we're looking at organizationally at the structure of a DAO, and we're looking at this also from incorporation perspective, it is a cooperative peer-to-peer structure that in more and more countries around the world is actually also legally getting recognition. So we're also pioneering that movement. And I think that's really beautiful. This is a recognition. There are new ways in which we as humans, being community oriented, can thrive together instead of driving our world towards collapse. We can use our collective intelligence, you know, for the most amazing things and creating technologies that work for a world that works for all.
Earlier on in my career, I was very competitive. I've learned that doesn't get you the best result. It's been a process to make that realization. I really like in the Sociocratic method, they have the expression, the role is not the soul. I think it serves organizations very well if they were to define, as we've suggested, that purpose-driven center and look at the dependencies, and not from a role or person or contributor perspective, but just literally what is the structure of an organization that would fulfill that purpose in the best way that we can think of it at the time. And then as another phase to then find opportunities where people can come in and contribute towards those things. I think somehow that's not what's done in traditional enterprise. You got the CEO and he's supposed to do X, Y, Z. You got the head of finance, you got the head of marketing, you got the head of infrastructure. The person gets the role, and that kind of defines exactly what they're supposed to do, what they're supposed to own, how they're supposed to interact. I think we're actually separating those things in this idea of a decentralized organization. We're saying that there is a center, that center is purpose. We're going to define exactly what things have to happen. And then we're going to find opportunities for roles that people as individuals, even fractional roles. Dom and I can both do a similar thing in certain situations, and we should be happy to be able to contribute to the requirement of the organization rather than squabbling over, well, that's not your role, that's my role. I think that is inherent in traditional organizational structures, and it's a very different ballgame in a DAO structure.
Around that change in accountability, the DAO creates a greater sense of accountability to the organization as a whole, the organizational purpose, the mission, the job, right? You're accountable to the commitment you've made to the other people that you're involved with in the organization. So you're competing with no one but yourself in order to achieve the result that you've stated that you plan to achieve. And in doing so, you no longer have to measure yourself in terms of how everyone around you is doing. It's no longer relevant. It doesn't really matter if person A over here is shining and doing extremely well in their role and person C is struggling. You don't have the incentive anymore to try to diminish person A, and you have every incentive to try to hold up and support person C, because the way I view it, I want to keep doing what I'm doing. And the only way in which I can do that is if everyone else is succeeding to some degree too. Because I could be excelling, and if everybody else is struggling, I'm not going to have a role. The enterprise is going to fail. Whereas in a typical business environment, I could be excelling and everybody else could be failing, and that would be just fine for me because I'll just take my accomplishments and bring them to the next firm. It's not that big of a deal, right? I mean, I might like the company or I might like the location or something, but for the most part, it's not a major concern. But in a DAO, it's just a different scenario. It's a different situation in which you're flipping so much of it, but it's very much a cooperative model. And Arseny, I think, said early on in the conversation today, everybody becomes an entrepreneur. And I believe that's true too. Certainly the elements of it, except it's a collective of entrepreneurs that are no longer in competition with one another and benefit far more from cooperation. The experience of people as they get into DAOs is going to be a level of work satisfaction that they didn't know existed.
And I think that answers the original question of what makes a DAO structure relevant to social entrepreneurship and purpose-driven organizations. It's like hand in glove. It just fits because people can contribute to the purpose rather than squabbling over role ownership and competitive nature.
Continue to be co-architects also. So
Yes.
It's not that the DAO is the ones, it's a created structure and now we have to just buy a license and that's it. No, you're creating a license as an architect. So everyone's an entrepreneur, but you're also co-architecting the continuous iteration of the DAO technologies.
So at the end of every conversation, I feel like we're just starting to open up the can of worms and we could speak for 5-7 hours. We're going to start making these live and we'll continue to ask difficult questions and explore this difficult space as we're developing clarity and learning how to communicate these experiences that we're having that other people are not yet having, and inviting people to come and participate and see what it's like, kick the tires, open a department for their organization, speak to us, and experiment with this new approach to purpose-driven organizational structures.